Tonight on Nation to Nation, climate change has suddenly become a pressing issue in Ottawa this week, especially over who has a plan and who doesn't.
It's been about 400 days since Andrew Scheer said he was going to come up with a climate plan.
Certainly our leader has indicated very clearly in the next few weeks he will be releasing our plan.
I don't think it's an accident that this is a response to the growing strength of the Green Party across the country.
I'm Todd Lamoran and welcome to Nation to Nation. In recent days there have been even more dire warnings about the state of the environment. For example, carbon dioxide levels have hit heights not seen in hundreds of thousands of years. But how serious are Canada's political parties about halting or reversing this trend? Conservative parties across Canada are fighting the federal government's carbon tax. This week, both the NDP and Liberals have presented motions in the House to debate the issue, although critics say their plans don't go far enough. To talk more about the issue, I'm joined by our political panel of MPs. Welcome to Nation to Nation. So, Ms. McLeod, I'm going to start with you. Many pundits say these House motions are to finally get the Conservatives to tell us what their environmental plan is. So why oppose the carbon tax so much if you don't have an alternative?
Certainly our leader has indicated very clearly in the next few weeks he will be releasing our plan. So climate change is real, it's a problem, and it needs a global solution. What we have from the Liberals, the carbon tax, and I want to note that for Indigenous peoples, it's hurting them the most. So it's really a tax plan, it's not a climate plan, and certainly experts say it's not even set at a level that will impact. We will, again, present a plan. You know, the NDP and the Liberals can go into dueling motions. You know, the NDP, they want to, continue to bring in oil from Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, but cut off Canadians getting their product to market. So, I think people will be really pleased when they hear what our plan is for the environment.
Okay, I see both of you nodding your heads already, so Mr. Vandal, I'll give you a chance to rebut which Ms. McLeod said.
Listen, it's been about 400 days since Andrew Scheer said he was going to come up with a climate plan, and we're a few months away from the election, and we still have not heard anything on what the Conservatives plan to do, or when they plan to present a climate plan, or even if they believe, or even if the leader believes that the climate crisis is real. So we've been very clear. We do have a plan which involves putting a price on pollution, which is very significant. It involves spending billions in alternative energy sources. It involves investing in transportation systems in cities to get cars off the road, and that's just a small portion of the plan. So we feel it's one of the most important issues going forward, certainly as a country, in the next election, and we are very cognizant of the fact that there's a climate crisis out there. Government needs to act both nationally as well as internationally.
You've mentioned the election a couple of times. It's coming up, but so why is your Minister of Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, doing a motion to declare a national climate emergency so late in the game?
Well, it's something that's, of course, you've cited the reports that have come out recently saying that that the world and Canada, in fact, is warming at twice the level which was anticipated. We understand that it's that it's an important issue for Canadians, and we want to make sure that Canadians get a choice to see where the political parties line up on climate action, and it's something we're looking forward to debating in the House of Commons.
Ms. Blaney, yesterday was a motion by the NDP about declaring a national emergency on climate. Some again would say it's, well, the timing of it. Are you feeling pressure from Green Party successes to finally declare this national emergency?
Well, the history of the NDP has always been one to fight for the environment. We just have to look at the history of Jack Layton, who put forward legislation in the House of Commons to talk about emissions and dealing with it. So there's a long history within our party to fight this issue. My concern, and listening to the response from my Liberal friend here, is the reality that, what we're actually seeing is largely implementation of Harper's climate change plan. The emissions that were set by the former government is still the emission targets that we have today. And when the Liberals were in opposition, they mocked those numbers and said we have to do much better. So after almost 4 years, where is that action? And we also have leadership that's doing things like buying pipelines, looking at sending a lot of money to Loblaws for fridges, when there's a lot of communities across this country that are really struggling with climate change. And it costs a lot of money. I think of my riding right now, North Island Powell River, so I am the island, but I'm also on the mainland. In one of our communities, we have a huge forest fire. I live in a rainforest. We don't have huge forest fires. You know, last year we had a really big forest fire in one of our small communities, Abalas. Those houses, 25 of them were evacuated. It was just in the last few weeks that 20 of those had the evacuation taken off of them. 5 houses are still in that. The reality on the ground is that this is a huge concern for people. Canadians want to see action. They want to see it now. They want to see it to be an inclusive process, though. They want to see it working with workers. I think of Iron Earth, which is in Alberta, doing a lot of great work looking at how do we move out of the oil and gas industry? How do we actually look at the workers of this country and make sure they have opportunities? And to have my conservative friends say, oh, they just want to get oil and gas from Saudi Arabia. Well, we have a lot of opportunities in this country. Why aren't we refining it in this country? When we look at jobs and opportunity, but we also have to take that next step. We have to be very courageous and make sure that we're looking at how we're going to have a more green economy. That's a lot of hard work. That's a complex job, but it needs to be done, and this government certainly has not taken leadership on it.
I think it is important to note, in spite of all their comments and their words, they, by their own paperwork, admits that they're not going to meet the Paris targets, which were, of course, originally our target. So what they've been doing in the last 3.5 years has done nothing to move us in the direction that they promised to move in.
Of course, McLeod is becoming an increasing concern for most Canadians, if you believe a lot of the polls. But how can Conservatives get more credibility on it if we just don't know where you're coming from?
You know, I think it's important. The election is in October. Right now, our job is to hold the government to account. It's not meeting its targets. It's putting out things that are just making life more expensive, like the carbon tax. Rural communities, in particular, are severely hurt by the carbon tax. We have plenty of time for people to look at our plan, assess our plan, and certainly I know that it will be part of the discussion in August and September and October as people are making their decisions. So I don't think that our job is to hold the government to account right now, and obviously we need to put out a platform that people can evaluate.
I'd love to look at the Conservatives' climate plan, but it's been 400 days since Andrew Scheer said he was going to present one, and there's still not a word on what they're going to do for the climate. As far as the NDP, they've been flip-flopping on this for the last 4 years. I think it has more to do with losing a seat in British Columbia last week to the Green Party, which is why they moved this motion. Prior to that election last week, the NDP supported the LNG expansion in British Columbia. This week, they no longer support it.
I will give you the last word on it, because I was going to ask you about it. What exactly he asked you about, it looks like your leader has flip-flopped on his support for LNG, which a lot of Indigenous groups do support.
Well, let's just say this. Bob Chamberlain ran for us in the Nanaimo Ladysmith riding, an Indigenous leader who has fought for climate action, for wild salmon, and for environmental issues. If this party did not take these issues seriously, then amazing candidates like Bob Chamberlain would not run for us. And when you look at what's happening in the north, I grew up in Terrace. I know that community. I know it very well. These are hard issues because we look at the poverty of communities, we look at the reality on the ground for those communities, and we look at Indigenous communities who want to see a better life for their communities. At the same time, we have to look at our climate targets. Finding a place to make those work together, that is hard work, and this government is doing nothing to start that process. And until we see that action happening, how can anybody in this country trust them when we see forest fires, when we see flooding, when we see people being evacuated from their homes? This is a climate crisis. This is hitting us hard, and we know what's happening in this country, and if we don't take it seriously, all of these communities are going to pay.
Well, we can certainly go on about this, but we have to move on. So after the break, we'll switch gears and talk about child welfare reform. Don't go away. Welcome back. Child welfare reform continues to sail through Parliament. It's called Bill C-92 and promises to hand over jurisdiction to Indigenous people. The House's Standing Committee on Indigenous Peoples is wrapping up its study, and even before C-92 was sent to the Senate, its Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples did a pre-study. In fact, the Senate delivered its report on Monday. And of note, we have our MPs talk about this again, and all three of you sit on the House committee. Yes. So, Mr. Vandal, I'll start with you. You were there on Tuesday. And almost all the witnesses talked about funding, and the Senate's pre-study talked about putting language in the bill that talks about equitable funding. Yeah. So is this the type of amendment that's a no-brainer and that will go through?
Well, certainly you're right. There was a lot of variety in the feedback we got, but the funding suggestion as amendment was fairly common. I can't pretell what committee is going to do tomorrow or next week when they start talking about the potential amendments. Unlike when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, when Stephen Harper controlled what committees decided and the amendments they brought forward, committees are independent. They're independent committees that can do what they like. So I think it makes sense, personally, to put some principles of funding in the bill. But ultimately, we'll see what committee decides.
Ms. Blaney, of course, you mentioned funding quite a bit when you were questioning the witnesses. Yeah. But are there other concerns that you have with this legislation?
Well, of course, I'm glad to hear my Liberal friend agree with me that funding actually needs to be put into the legislation. We want to see principles here so that we see the end of what's been happening for way too long in this country. But there are some significant challenges with this bill. I will be supporting it. I think Indigenous people need to have that next step of jurisdiction. I'm just concerned about the amount of jurisdiction they're actually going to get. The other part that is, I just think there's a lot of complexity, and the care of the child and making sure the child is at the center of it is really where we need to go. And when I look at this current government's relationship with the Human Rights Tribunal decision, and that we're now, I believe, 7 or 8 times non-compliance messages have been sent. We're still waiting for that. Indigenous children have waited far too long in this country. We saw and we've met more than one witness that actually came from the foster system, and they talked about the challenges, how alone they felt, how disconnected they felt, how heartbreaking it was for them to finally maybe get to know their family and loved ones when they are adults. So, you know, we need to make sure that this is done right. I will be proposing several amendments, and I look forward to the vigorous debate, and I certainly hope that this government listens to what the testimony is. Let's move forward, but let's make sure we do it right.
Ms. McLeod, was your colleague Kevin Waugh, Conservative MP from Saskatchewan, who brought up that especially on the prairies there are First Nations that are vehemently opposed to this, but the leaders still want to go ahead and have this passed. Is there a feeling we've got to get this passed because if there's a change in government, a Conservative government won't entertain this?
We have supported this bill at second reading. We have been very working with the committee, doing extra long hours because we believe it's important. We believe the devolution of child welfare services to communities is absolutely critical. I think what it points out to is for a government to bring something forward when we only have another 4 weeks in session, and it's, in spite of us trying to work really hard to do the diligence we need to do, we're really up against the timeline. And we know that if it doesn't get done now, it takes a while, regardless of which government forms, you know, to get things back on track. It would probably not be seen again until next year, and it just puts everything behind. And I don't think, you know, children can wait in terms of moving forward. So the fact that it came so late to Parliament is a problem, but certainly it's not a perfect bill. It's a bill that doesn't have unanimity, and never will. But I think, you know, for the communities that want to utilize the opportunities within this bill, I think it's there for them.
Mr. Vandal, you actually challenged some witnesses over whether Indigenous law will trump provincial and federal law. Yes. Why did you feel you had to do that?
Well, I think because there's I think the important part of this bill is that it puts into law what Indigenous nations have been asking for decades, and that's it affirms the inherent jurisdiction of Indigenous nations to make their own laws. And clearly, there's clauses in the bill that say after a year of negotiation or discussion with both levels of government, provincial and federal, if there is no resolution to the discussion, the Indigenous law, the law of the Indigenous nation, will prevail over the provincial government and the federal government, and that's quite clear. There are some people who are groups that appeared before committee that simply either that's not clear to them, or they're certainly not giving that message. So I think that's the important part of the bill. We affirm the inherent right of nations to make their own laws, and this is for across Canada. So we are affirming the inherent right in Manitoba and British Columbia, in the Atlantic provinces, and for Métis, Inuit, and First Nation.
Ms. Blaney, is it better to pass an imperfect bill than nothing at all?
Well, that's a really interesting question. You know what, I am working really hard to make sure that there is an option for people who want to opt out but have resources included in this. And we definitely heard from several groups that they are concerned, that they are doing things within their own regions that are making all the difference, and they feel like that's where they want to stay. They don't want to be under this framework. So we have to look at that. We need to see a government, this government, and future governments listen carefully to what Indigenous leaders are saying. They know the work that they're doing on the ground. And some of those communities and those groups just need to see, is this really going to work? And there are some things that are concerning. I hear what my Liberal friend is saying, but the reality is legal experts are saying, no, this does not go over federal jurisdiction. You just have to look at all of it. You can't take one part of a piece of legislation and say, no, this makes everything okay. You have to look at it all together. And there is still some speculation about how that's going to be implemented. You know, I have been a foster parent. I've done foster parenting on reserve to keep our children in the community because it was so important to my family and to our community. I know how hard it is to do that work. We need to see children staying in their communities. So I'm going to support this, but I'm going to be also fighting hard to make sure that those leaders in this country that are doing amazing work have the right to opt out, but finally get the resources they so desperately need.
Okay. We're out of time. It's our second to last panel, so maybe we can pick this up next time we meet. We'll see. But I want to thank you for talking to me today.
It's always a pleasure.
Coming up after the break, Green Party Elizabeth May drops by. Welcome back. As I mentioned earlier, the House of Commons debated two motions, both declaring climate emergencies. Yesterday, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh introduced one, and today another one by Environment and Climate Change Minister Catherine McKenna. To talk more about the climate emergency declarations, I'm joined by Green Party leader Elizabeth May, who also held a press conference earlier today to unveil a 20-point climate action plan. Ms. May, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you mentioned in your press conference that with the by-election win by Paul Manley, you've doubled your impact, and hence there are now two motions declaring a climate emergency. Were you kind of tongue-in-cheek, or was there some seriousness there?
Well, I think it's, I'm very happy that both the Liberal Party and the New Democrats introduced motions to call and recognize that we're in a climate emergency. Parliaments around the world have been doing this. But I think the timing's, it's pretty hard not to notice that the media said, oh, Paul Manley winning in Nanaimo Ladysmith. Heck, the Prime Minister said it as he left the cabinet meeting. This shows voters are concerned about climate change. So I brought the emergency debate forward with other colleagues, a Liberal and a New Democrat, back in October to debate this as a national climate emergency. None of the other leaders came for that debate. We had a debate, but it didn't result in a resolution that could say we're in a national climate emergency. So I welcome this entirely. But I don't think it's an accident that this is a response to the growing strength of the Green Party across the country. So if this is a response to our growing strength, let's have more, because we can make more progress.
You repeatedly said that it needs to be nonpartisan. I did watch some of yesterday's debate, and especially when Conservative MP Michelle Rempel got up and talked, and then in response to that, I mean, how do you achieve a nonpartisan approach when you see things like that happening?
Yeah, well, what we're calling for in our plan, which we launched today, called Mission Possible. So, I mean, a lot of us grew up with Mission Impossible. We need to recognize that what needs to be done is difficult, but it's possible. And to make it nonpartisan, what we're calling for is that after the next election, whoever forms government should include all parties in an inner cabinet. So the regular cabinet positions would continue as normal, but this is based on the historical precedents of Winston Churchill in the UK, Mackenzie King in Canada, during the Second World War, saying sometimes decisions are so important, you don't want partisan politics getting in the way. And we really need to put Canada and the countries around the world on a footing that's a lot like being on a war footing, in that we are all in this together and we have to pull together.
Do you think anything will come out of these debates that have happened over the past 2 days?
I hope so. I genuinely hope so. I mean, to declare a climate emergency and have that vote pass Parliament, which it surely will, one of these motions will pass because the Liberals have a majority. To declare a climate emergency and then, for instance, continue to have the same target that Stephen Harper left behind, which is Canada's current target, which takes us into, well, not just dangerous territory, potentially fatal territory for our civilization. We need to do more than what's currently being offered. And in an election campaign, if we have and this is hard, of course, you just said how partisanship gets in the way in Parliament. In an election campaign, it's very hard to imagine how it can be sufficiently nonpartisan that we can have a serious conversation about what needs to be done. But it's my hope that we can have that kind of conversation even in a national election campaign.
Of course, it's no secret. We've mentioned it so many times. It's going to be an election. And part of it's going to be fought, of course. Andrew Scheer, the Conservatives, want to get rid of the carbon tax. And his big climate plan is going to come out in 3 weeks, he says. What are you expecting from it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that Andrew Scheer understands the climate crisis from a point of view of understanding the science. I would like to have real scientific briefings so that every MP understands exactly how dangerous this is. But I imagine that the Conservative plan will be the worst possible plan, except for the plan that we haven't seen from People's Party and Maxime Bernier. The problem is that where you have good rhetoric and a claim of climate leadership from the Liberals, but then they buy the pipeline and then they continue to subsidize fossil fuels. I don't want to be partisan about it. I want a real plan, and I want to know that we're going to leave fossil fuels in the ground, do much more with renewable energy. By the way, our plan released today talks about the importance of partnerships with Indigenous peoples, making sure that that right now we're seeing a lot of renewables starting up in Indigenous territories with First Nations leadership, Inuit and Métis leadership. We need to do far more to capitalize on the opportunity of moving to 100% renewable electricity, and then we can move to electric cars, give up on the internal combustion engine, and so on. So I'll wait and hope to be surprised by Andrew Scheer's plan, but I think we'll probably see no carbon taxes, maybe more regulations, because if you don't use carbon pricing, you're going to use more regulations. That's not a bad thing if it's aggressive, but I have a feeling they're going to continue to want to keep Jason Kenney happy in Alberta.
I'll have to leave it there, but I want to thank you, Ms. May, for coming in and talking to me.
Thank you so much.
That's our show, but if you missed any part of it or a past episode, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.